Well, now, Al, most people are familiar with Al Stewart through your 1976 hit, of course, Year of the Cat, then 1978, Time Passages. Now, there's been some time in between those major hits. What's been going on with you?
Good question. I'm glad you asked me that. I've been touring a lot. We've toured all over Europe. We've toured Japan. We've done every club in America several times over, I think. Some are wonderful. There's one we call the Psychedelic Dungeon. I won't tell you where that is. Yeah. And we've released, I think, 1, 2, 3... and this will be the 4th record since since Time Passages. In order to keep things rolling, we've been touring a lot, and of course we've been writing lots of new songs, and we have a new record to show that have been working.
Now, you actually had a couple of albums that went platinum.
Yes, I did. You mentioned both of them. That's the beginning and end. Yeah, right. I had 6 before Year of the Cat, and I've had 5 since it. So it's rather odd. I was around for quite a long time before Year of the Cat, beginning in England, around the folk scene, and then over here, and I toured with Linda Ronstadt and all sorts of people as an opening act, and so there was 10 years of slogging around the clubs before that. Year of the Cat and Time Passages did indeed go time platinum, yes, platinum, okay, and but they were the only 2.
20th century Al Stewart.
Yeah.
A brief history, a brief musical history.
Okay, a mosaic. I guess I left school when I was about 17, and this was terrific because it was 63, and the Beatles were, they just really were breaking and happening all over England, although it was going to take another year before they happened in America. And every kid in England wanted to be a Beatle. I mean, I think 1 in 3 males in England took up the guitar. I mean, maybe not for very long, but I mean, everyone I went to school with, I mean, everyone that I knew, all the kids in the streets of Bournemouth, this little town where I grew up, they all wanted to be a Beatle. I wanted to be Al Beatle. I mean, it was like my dream. Along came the Rolling Stones, and for a while I wanted to be Keith Richards, and I had a recurring fantasy. It was so vivid. Mick Jagger would knock on my door at midnight and say, we got a gig at Birmingham Town Hall tomorrow night, and Keith can't make it. You've got to come and fill in for him, So when I was 17 years old, I either wanted to be a Beatle or a Rolling Stone, and I just would read articles on them, and I read an article on the Hollies, and it described, a typical day in their life. Like, they would get up at 11 o'clock in the morning and, sort of like have breakfast, and someone would come around and photograph them, and they'd go down the studio and cut a hit record and come back and have tea and sort of watch a movie and go to bed. And I thought, well, I don't know what this is all about, but I want it. I mean, I want this lifestyle. I want sort of, how bad can it be to be standing in Shea Stadium with 50,000 people screaming at you while you go, she loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it was great. Or the Stones, or any of that. And I basically had this fantasy until 1967. Although I'd become interested in lyrics through listening to Bob Dylan, but in 1967 I was still thinking in terms of rock and roll, because I still had delusions that I could play a guitar. And I went to the Savile Theatre, which was Brian Epstein's theatre in London, classic theatre, a little 600-seater, and Jimi Hendrix played 3 times that year. It was, these were his first concerts in England. And I walked out of the first Jimi Hendrix concert knowing that I would never, as long as I lived, be a lead guitar player in a rock band. I mean, it was just, I thought, throw it away. I still had one at that time. I said, sell it, get rid of it. Go into being a greengrocer. I mean, anything. You were never going to be able to do that as long as you lived. The 60s, the late 60s particularly, were the time of the singer-songwriter, and most of them had terrible voices. I mean, even worse than mine. I mean, Leonard Cohen was sort of grunting and growing and groaning, and Dylan, I mean, was wheezing, and but they were coming up with these amazing lyrics, just these whole portraits, paintings, and words. And I thought, well, I can do that. I mean, it's not like looking at Hendrix and thinking I could never do that. I thought, Bob Dylan, the purple haze of infinity crashes through the conundrums of my subconscious oblivion into the trees of infinity. I mean, sure, I can do this, I mean, or whatever it is, and so take me to it, because I've always been able to rhyme things, apart from Orange and Desert, which nobody can rhyme. And so I got an acoustic guitar, and I set off to be Al Dylan, having failed to be Al Beatle and having been subverted by Al Hendrix. But by now, something called folk rock had happened, and I think probably Simon and Garfunkel and the Byrds and Dylan, again, to some extent, were responsible for this thing, whereby singer-songwriters, there had been James Taylor and Joni Mitchell and a lot of others had come along in the meantime, and they got themselves little bands together, and they were putting together what essentially were the aspects of folkiness, like the lyrical concentration, with a sort of like soft rock backing, which, for lack of a better word, in the 60s was called folk rock, and the 70s. So I began experimenting, first of all, in fact, with Fairport Convention, who played on one of my albums, and a Collection, who were another English band in the Fairport style, and some of the people from Steel Eye Span, my contemporaries in England. And then eventually I came over here with a band of diverse musicians, Peter White included, who is sitting over there, and
hi Peter,
and people like Tim Rennick, who's now playing with the Pink Floyd, and Peter Wood, who's the co-composer of Year of the Cat.
Also, didn't you play with Jimmy Page?
And if
Rick
you go,
Wakeman.
Oh yeah, all of those people. Jimmy was on 3 of my records, and Rick was on a couple, and Bob Fripp, of course, lived down the road from me, and there were a variety of English musicians I worked with, but I didn't mention those because they're not directly in the folk rock field. I have worked with, obviously, people from outside my field, but I was just being chronological here and describing how I got back into bands again. On Year of the Cat, what I consciously did was I put together the folk rock of modern times with a little bit of the historical folkiness that had been on Past, Present and Future, the album before it. And I figured if I threw the two sides, if I threw a little bit of the intellectual side and a little bit of the toe-tapping side together, we would have a hit, and lo and behold, we did. It sounds easy in retrospect. It wasn't at the time, but that was the philosophy behind it. A quick evolution of a folk rock artist.
What I also want to ask you about, though, what we touched upon was the Jimmy Page.
Yeah.
Now, people listening to your music and people listening to Jimmy Page would never really put the two of you together off the top of their heads.
Well, I guess they don't know him very well. He was a rabid acoustic guitar fan, and especially Bert Jansch fan, and this is an interesting story. You asked me, so I'll tell you. I got in the middle of a lawsuit for no reason, that was my fault. What happened was that when Zepp did their first album, Bert had come out with a record called Jack Orion, and he had a song called Black Waterside on it, and I was sitting, the first time Bert Jansch ever played Black Waterside, I was about 3 feet in front of him. I was in the front row of a tiny club in the West End of London, and I was absolutely blown away. I was watching this man's fingers on this guitar, and I couldn't believe anyone could play like that. I'd never seen anything like it. All the bass notes were moving, and all the treble notes were moving, and Bert had a habit of snapping the string against the neck of the guitar, which was his unique style. I don't think anyone else plays like that. I don't think they did before, and probably haven't since. And so I took myself off for about a month and worked out a version of Black Waterside. It wasn't a very good version, but it was close. And then I did, in '66, I went around and made my first single. This was long before my first album. And Jimmy Page, this is where I met him. The flip side of the single was a Yardbirds tune. Actually, I think it was written by, what was his name? Was it Samuel Smith? I think it was. Do you remember that guy? I don't know. Yardbirds fans will know it. And so it's one of his songs. And so Jimmy played up just to go chunk, literally, on an old Telecaster that by chance belonged to Jeff Beck. And we got talking in between takes, and he said he was such a big fan of Bert Jansch and John Renbourn. Did I know them? And I said, well, I just spent the last year and a half at close proximity watching every move they've made. And I said, incidentally, have you heard this? This is Bert's new thing. So I played him it, and we got into it. We did it for about half an hour, and I showed Jimmy about as much as I knew of it, by which time he knew it better than I did. And I didn't think much more of it until, of course, the first Zeppelin album came out, and lo and behold, here's this thing called Black Mountainside, which is, very, very, very close, especially the riff, which I had taught him in the studio. And so Heathside Music, which was, I guess, Bert's publishing company, got very, very upset, even though it's a traditional tune, because the arrangement was so similar. And they phoned me up and said, we hear that, you taught Jimmy Page how to play this, and is this true? Well, in the meantime, I had met Peter Grant, who, as you know, is not a man to be messed with. And I said, I think I have a lapse of memory on this one. I don't think I recall too closely. So I never did get hauled into court, and I don't really know how it was settled, but I guess they just settled it. So that was how I met Jimmy. And then he came in and played on both Love Chronicles, which was my second album, and Zero She Flies, which was my third.
Now, Al, I'd like for you to tell me about the current album, because I know I've been waiting for quite some time for it.
The new record is called The Last Days of the Century, and it's, at least on the CD, it's good value for money because it runs 55 minutes. And I think there are 12 or 13 different things on it, and it's on Enigma Records and Tapes. And you need to know more about it than that, don't you?
Well, I'd like to know a little bit more about it, because once again, a lot of songs on the album are dealing with historic events. You're going back into history again, which is not, what you say, the normal way that people write. I mean, usually people are writing about, like, I love you, or he hates her, or, I love you, and he loves him.
Bad song lyric is, woke up this morning in the Holiday Inn, you were fat and I was thin. I mean, like, it's sort of essentially, most songs say a variation of that. Perhaps they're more oblique, whatever. And the history thing, apart from the fact that I read history all the time, it's, I just love the way it fits with song. You know, I just think it's great. I used to like the works of John Dowland, who's a 16th century English composer, mostly of unrequited love songs. On the new album, in a song about Josephine Baker, who was a dancer in the 1920s in Paris, amongst other things, I sing a song, I'm sometimes trapped by the close confines of the age I'm born in too, and though there are others worse than mine, still I miss what I can't do. Join the feast of ancient Greece, see Alexander's library, or maybe clink a champagne toast with a jazz-age dancing queen. It is this feeling of going from age to age effortlessly, which is very appealing to me.
Who's playing on the album?
Well, Peter White is playing on it. He plays all sorts of Spanish guitars. I think you play all the acoustic guitars on the album, don't you, just about?
I think so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wonderful, as a matter of fact.
So there's,
good job there, Peter.
Thank you.
His usual stuff on Spanish guitar, which we've made into a bit of a thing in our show. Not many people use nylon-strung Spanish guitar, and I think the first time we used it, Peter played Spanish guitar on the Border off the Year of the Cat album, and ever since then we've tried to use it more, and on the new album there's quite a lot of it. The rhythm section is Vinnie Caliuta and Tim Landers, and they were suggested by Joe Ciccarelli, who is the producer. So producers tend to come with their own rhythm sections. They will say, look, these guys are great, use them. I've got no quarrel with that. They are great. For the first time ever, we've used quite a lot of fretless bass, because Tim Landers played fretless bass very well, and it's all over the record. I don't think I've ever had that on an album before. So that turns up all over the place. And we have some old faces from the past reunited for this album, which is fun. We have Phil Kenzie playing saxophone. He played on both Year of the Cat and Time Passages, so it's good to have him back. And Tim Rennick, who's been on every major record I've ever had, he turns up to play a guitar solo on Antarctica. And we have Peter Wood, who is the co-composer of Year of the Cat, playing piano on 4 tracks. So, have I missed anyone major out?
That's Steve Farris.
Oh, Steve Farris, yeah, from Mr. Mister. He turns up and plays, I think, 3 guitar solos.
How has your music changed over the years?
I don't think it has. This is the 12th album, and I don't think I've changed musically at all. Basically, the philosophy that I had in '67 when I started recording was keep the music simple, make the lyrics interesting.
What about the first single?
The first single, again, is geographical, as are so many of them. This one's called The King of Portugal. And this is very tongue-in-cheek. I was asked, I don't know, I get asked from time to time, what would you do if you didn't do what you're doing? And I figure the only thing I'm capable of being is a king. I would make an extremely good king. Some of my ancestors were kings back in Scotland, and so I'd be very democratic. I'd be an enlightened monarch. And I gave this some thought, and I thought, now, do I want to be a king of a major country like America? And the answer is, well, you tend to get into too many wars, and I mean, it'd be hard to get things through the Senate and the Congress. I mean, I looked into the Constitution. I know that I can't, I can't be made a king because you don't allow it. I can't see any reason why I shouldn't run for king, and I may well do it. The idea of turning the White House into the White Palace and, sort of creating, I know you could create sort of Lord Robert Dillon and sort of Sir Lee Iacocca, and you could knock down every building over 4 stories high and raise the speed limit. I mean, there are all sorts of things that I could do, but I don't think any of these would get past the Senate. So I was looking around.
Doubtful.
Looking around, and I thought, I want a place that's nice and close to Bordeaux because I like wine. I want a nice warm climate. I'd like a country that's big enough to support me in the manner to which I know I could become accustomed, and small enough to keep out of trouble. And so I picked Portugal. Now, the reason I picked Portugal was because I've never been there. It's the only European country, along with Austria, at least the only Western European country along with Austria, that I've never visited. And there's nothing again in the Portuguese constitution that I come across that forbids a Scottish monarch from occupying their throne. So I decided that had I the magic wand to wave, and if someone said, what would you like to be if you were not Al Stewart, the roving troubadour and historical singer-songwriter, I thought, well, it might be fun, at least for a while, to see how it went to be the King of Portugal. So with that as my jump-off point, I began to write about dreaming of being the King of Portugal, and that's the one